Adyashanti's teaching on the no-self experience. Nini Praetorius on behalf of Adyashanti. Abstract. In this paper, an attempt is made to present Adyashanti's rich and profound rendering of the lived experience of no-self. To fully understand what this state entails, it is necessary to view the trajectory of forms and qualities that consciousness can take during the spiritual unfolding, and how the experience of no-self fits into the overall arch of awakening from ego to self and from self to no-self. This presentation is based on a study course by Adyashanti called The Experience of No-Self, and addresses and thoroughly discuss issues concerning ego, self, and no-self, defined as particular acts and types of consciousness, and the shifting from ego to self and from self to no-self, and the ensuing loss of will of ego and self. Finally, the paper presents what is entailed in letting go of both ego and self, and elaborates on the human expression of life beyond self, and thus of becoming what we eternally are. The falling away of self is the most significant, bewildering, and liberating spiritual event in one's entire life, and perhaps the least understood. Adyashanti. Introduction. Adyashanti was one of the first spiritual masters to be invited to this frontiers research topic. However, numerous Sangha meetings and retreats already planned well into the future bade him to decline. Only a couple of weeks later, however, Adyashanti launched a live online study course with the title Experiencing No-Self. So after renewed exchanges, I was given permission to write this paper on the basis of, and with extensive use of quotations from his teachings in this 8-hour long study course about the lived experience of no-self. Adyashanti sets out in this course, firstly, to explore the precarious territory of no-self and to understand exactly what the experience of no-self is. Secondly, to account for how no-self fits in within the overall arch of awakening. And thirdly, to guide the ever more numerous spiritual seekers who nowadays appear to be approaching the realization of no-self and who are struggling with and getting stuck in the various phases on the path towards it, as well as in the wide variety of different, highly significant, yet potentially confusing moments of this very state itself. The notion of no-self figures prominently in the teachings and debates within different Western spiritual cultures, and so do discussions of all sorts of corollary philosophical and theological issues about this state and notion. Adyashanti has no intention to take part in these discussions, let alone to develop a new philosophy or theology about no-self. Now, philosophical inquiries as to what this notion refers to and implies, or how one may function without having or experiencing a self, or how there can be free will if there is no self, etc., are not necessarily worthless or without merit, according to Adyashanti. However, such discussions do not get to the heart of the matter, which is the direct experience of no-self. Quite on the contrary, philosophical wanderings and quandaries about no-self are as far away from the actual experience of no-self as sitting in your room thinking about the sun is from experiencing the actual sun itself. You can sit in your room and think of the sun, but it doesn't make you warm. Thinking of the sun has nothing to do with the sun, nor with the actual lived experience of the sun. Even worse, all the corollary philosophical questions that the mind can occupy itself with often boils down to a very sophisticated means of holding on to a self. In what follows, an account will be attempted of Adyashanti's rich and profound rendering of the lived experience of no self. To fully understand what this state entails, it is necessary to view the trajectory of forms and qualities that consciousness can take in one's spiritual unfolding, i.e., how, according to Adyashanti, it fits into the overall arch of awakening, that is to say, the arch of awakening from ego to awakening to self, and awakening from self to awakening to no self. The paper is divided into 4 parts corresponding to the 4 sessions of Adyashanti's study course of experiencing no self. Part 1. Ego, Self and No Self introduces Adyashanti's concepts of ego, self and no self, which he defines as acts of consciousness and forms that consciousness can take. During this presentation, the following issues are addressed: the transcendence of ego or self vs. the falling away of ego or self. This part is concluded by a first general outline of the features and aspects of the no-self experience. Part 2. The continuum of ego, self and no-self presents Adyashanti's view on the entanglement of ego and self in what is called the egoic state and the development of witnessing in spirituality. Moreover, he elaborates further on the shifting from ego to self and on the continuum of the higher self to no self. He then details further aspects of experiencing no self and accounts for the loss of will and motivation of ego and self. In Part 3, the nature, qualities and dimensions of no self, Adyashanti first explains what it means to letting go completely of ego and self and how it is experienced. Next, he elaborates on the expressions of life beyond self and of what becoming what we eternally are entails. Finally, Adyashanti describes relating from and trusting divine wisdom and love. Part 4. How things are experienced beyond self first presents Adyashanti's view on why describing life beyond self experientially is essential. Here, he also explains the difference between the conditioned mind of ego and self and the unconditioned mind beyond self. This part concludes with a detailed description of the very different forms of conventional, feeling-based love through to the transition of love beyond self. Part 1. Ego, Self and No Self. Any moment of transcendence is a mortal blow to the ego. It begins the ego's demise. You see that what you thought defined you is not actually what you are, but something which exists within you. Adyashanti. Ego. It is well known that within philosophy and psychology there are many definitions and complex theories of ego. However, according to Adyashanti, ego is actually something very simple. Ego is simply self-concern, self-obsession. It's to be identified with one's inner psychology, meaning all the self-referencing ideas, thoughts, opinions, judgments, storylines, all of that. This portrayal, says Adyashanti, is not meant in a judgmental way or to say that there is something wrong about it or that it shouldn't be like that. It's just simply defining ego as what it basically is, i.e., the act of consciousness being obsessed with the inner psychology. The very mature ego is completely obsessed with its own self-concern. Everything becomes filtered into how is this for me? What do I think about this? What's my judgment about that? That is, everything becomes filtered through the ego, the act of self-concern. More specifically, says Adyashanti, ego is the act of being trapped in an identity and a worldview predominantly viewed through one's self-concern. That's basically how everybody starts out with an ego development. A more grown-up or mature ego, a healthy ego, will eventually begin to reach out beyond its own self-obsession and be concerned and truly care about and have feeling for something beyond itself. For example, concern for the loved ones, the family, and perhaps it would go a little bit wider to the local community, people in one's religion and culture and maybe country. Then it would go to something much vaster, to humanity at large. As the ego matures, it starts to outgrow and relinquish its obsessive self-concern, and its orientation is no longer completely fixated in its own psychology, its own story. However, ego, even in its higher sense, in its highest desires, is still self-centered act of desire, craving, wanting, and aversion, of pushing away, rejecting. I don't want this. I do want that. This is the movement of the ego. Not what ego is doing, but what the ego is. And this movement of desire and aversion contributes to its self-centered orientation. Different kinds of spiritual practices are meant to loosen up this adherence to and boundedness of the ego. First and foremost, because our ego orientation is self-defeating, i.e., in the sense of being the cause of the vast majority of suffering that people experience. When someone is really bound in the ego, says Adyashanti, one has a feeling of being encased and enclosed and small and isolated. So spirituality is initially trying to support the letting go of being so bounded of ego, i.e., by supporting the opening up to something bigger. This could be by tapping into the higher ego's morality, which is the concern of all being and the welfare of all life. Or it could be by tapping into a love of God, or it could be into existential questions such as what is reality, what is really true. These are all ways that ego looks for a deeper truth than itself, its self-concern and self-obsession. And it is ego being more in touch with the more mature aspects indeed. It's actually the very highest function an ego can take, and spirituality helps one get in there. There are all kinds of means of going about loosening this sort of self-obsession. For example, prayer, meditations, contemplation, and spiritual inquiry. Of course, says Adyashanti, one often realizes that ego is a very mercurial verb, a very mercurial movement of consciousness. For a long time, it will keep forming itself into new identities. So, what initially happens when you get involved in spirituality is that you no longer experience yourself as an isolated human being. The ego takes on a deeper identification. Now, you're a Christian, a Buddhist, a Jew, or any of the other, a Hindu. That is, the ego re-identifies with a spiritual identity. The ego can play almost any game you can imagine. It's extremely moldable. Indeed, one of its main tendencies is to keep turning itself into new forms all the time. And this continues until we start developing a kind of wisdom and become familiar with the ways the ego shapeshifts. When at a certain point you start to see the whole movement of ego, says Adyashanti, something deeper starts to recognize it. Ego and self as forms of consciousness. Adyashanti uses two terms, ego and self, to denote two different forms of consciousness. Ego, as we have seen, is a form of consciousness being obsessed with its own self-concern. Self, on the other hand, is what which looks at ego. It's the act of reflecting within. Put differently, self is the act of self-consciousness, and self-consciousness is what self is. Ego, then, is what self-consciousness reflects upon when it's look inside. What self-consciousness sees and experiences in its center, in its own inner personal psychology, is what we call ego. Now, when you have a deep experience of going beyond that ego identity and transcending it, says Adyashanti, you start to experience and know yourself not to be the ego. The ego may be there, i.e., all your thinking, feelings, and inner psychology, but you know that it doesn't define you. In other words, when you go to a deeper dimension of experience, a wider dimension, you see that what you thought defined you is actually not what you are, but simply something that exists within experience. This kind of insight is often a very profound, a freeing, very liberating, says Adyashanti. It's a kind of an aha! I thought I was what I felt and what I imagined, and all my judgments and opinions, I thought that all of that was me. Even worse than that, I thought that all of that was true. In the moment of transcending it, you realize a bigger dimension of experience, and all you thought you were is now something that exists merely as your experiences. Adyashanti describes it in this way. So, when you have awoken to a deeper dimension of being, it often feels like you have transcended ego, and for a while it can seem like the ego is completely non-functional. You can be in a complete state of flow, which is what it feels like not to be trapped in ego. It feels like a flow, a certain kind of ease and a certain kind of lack of self-consciousness, a lack of egoic consciousness actually. And that feels very easy and flowing and open and free and dynamic and vital. It is also simple, quiet, and quite beautiful. And for a while, since the experience of revelation may be, in some instances, quite overwhelming and empowering, it may seem like the ego is completely gone. But in many instances, probably most, some amount of the egoic structure will automatically start to try to put itself back together. It can never put itself back together in the same completeness once you've seen through it. However, it differs from one individual to the other how much the ego puts itself back together. One of the ways the ego puts itself back together is by trying to hold on to a moment of spiritual revelation. In other words, by trying to hold on to a moment of awakening. The ego thinks, I want this and I don't want to lose it. But Adyashanti reminds us, as soon as you think, I don't want to lose this wonderful and beautiful experience, it is still self-concern. And as soon as there is self-concern, you start to grasp at what you don't want to lose. And as soon as you grasp at it, your grasping solidifies the experience of ego. Now, says Adyashanti, you can't actually lose the deeper dimension of being, but you can succumb to the ego reconstructing upon itself. It is quite common during one's spiritual encounter with the facets and structures of ego that one will be longing for the revelation that brought it about. Part of the journey will be realizing that in order to get beyond the ego again, you have to stop grasping, even at revelation. It's only ego that sees itself as other than, and therefore tries to sustain that experience and possess it or grasp it and own it. However, all kinds of grasping, no matter what kind of grasping, no matter what level the grasping is happening at, is essentially an egoic activity. Again, this isn't to judge it or condemn it or to make it wrong. It's just saying, call it what it is. In conclusion, ego is a movement of consciousness according to Adyashanti. It's a verb, a form that consciousness takes. There's not an entity in there called ego. The question of why it takes that form, says Adyashanti, is one of these philosophical questions that keep you spinning on the periphery of experiencing and never diving in. Most questions will keep you spinning on the periphery of something much more profound, so it is really not useful to ask why. The impossibility of the egoic state of knowing what's beyond its own domain. Now, there is the transcendence of ego, and then there's falling away of ego. Falling away of ego would mean that grasping at all levels and pushing away at all levels ceases. People think of the non-egoic state, i.e., where there's no ego, in all sorts of ridiculous ways, according to Adyashanti. However, ego cannot imagine anything beyond its own domain. It tries, it thinks it knows, but it doesn't. So all the ideas that the mind or ego has about what the state beyond the ego is going to be like are just egoic ideas. Only when we go beyond it do we realize this, and realize that before what we knew nothing about it. Spiritual teachers at all times have been suggesting to people to let go of what they think they know, especially concerning deep spiritual states of being. So one should not worry about what's around the next corner, says Adyashanti, because thinking what we know, indeed what we could possibly know, is a defense against realizing it, against your own unfolding. The experience beyond ego. When you transcend the ego, there's a sense of relief, according to Adyashanti, the constriction and the friction which is ego sees. The aversion and desire used to create a friction inside, but now it's gone, as well as the self-images and ideas about ourselves and others, about the world. Am I good? Am I bad? Am I wrong? Am I worthy? Am I unworthy? All this conflicting emotional turmoil that ego is made up of it is gone. When we connect with a much deeper impulse within ourselves, says Adyashanti, all of a sudden we feel an interior unification, a smoothness, a flow, a sense of a lack of anxiety, a lack of a kind of boundedness. When ego drops away, that sense of psychological boundedness drops away with it. According to the teachings of Adyashanti, one of the great mistakes so often made in modern days spirituality is that the experience of transcendence of ego is erroneously taken to be the falling away of ego. Another, and even worse, is that transcendence of ego is mistaken for the falling away of self. However, they are completely and absolutely different things, as we shall see in the section which follows. The falling away or death of ego. In contrast to the momentary transcendence of ego, the permanent falling away of ego is often precipitated with a feeling of kind of death. Ego doesn't have to die to merely transcend. Indeed, it doesn't have to do anything in order to transcend. And that is one of the nice things about it. As a matter of fact, according to Adyashanti, this non-doing is actually one of the access points to transcending the ego. That is, to stop doing anything about it. However, often in spiritual work, we're obsessively trying to do something about our ego, and that's actually what keeps us bound to it. So when we stop doing this, even for a moment, then consciousness can go beyond. It can transcend. However, there is an innate fear within the ego of going beyond itself, since the ego can't know anything beyond itself. So when consciousness starts to move beyond the ego to the boundary of the ego is going to feel literally, experientially, that it is going to die. It's not so much that that it's going to die, but it cannot know what's beyond itself. All this has nothing to do with what's beyond the ego, but it has everything to do with what ego imagines it's beyond itself. Since it can't imagine anything beyond itself, it can only conclude that it's a kind of annihilation. Fortunately, you're not ego, essentially, since you can go beyond it. But the ego can't make its own disappearance happen. It can't get rid of itself any more than your foot can outrun itself. Any effort by ego to get beyond itself is just another act of self-concern and self-obsession. To relinquish that, however, is often a very scary thing for ego, very disorienting. So it tends to clutch until it's ready to not clutch. And when it's ready to not clutch, to stop doing, it just doesn't clutch anymore. That's grace. What self-consciousness reflects when the ego falls away? When ego finally falls away, there's an experience of great peace and lack of division, psychologically. And what self-consciousness then reflects upon is this lack of division. So your sense of your own being is no longer the ego, which fell away, but it becomes an empty center, an aware empty space. When it reveals itself as that empty center, it reveals itself as divine. However, according to Adyashanti, not divine as in philosophy or theology. It is experienced as divine, as precious and unconditioned, almost as the origin and the unmanufactured source of life, as something of extraordinary meaning. Although you can never verbalize what the meaning is, it is of an extraordinary significance. It's to be unified within. So the act of self, which is just a reflecting, used to look upon ego, but now ego is not there. Instead, there is a kind of emptiness, which reveals itself to be divine, to be an infinite ground of being. One could go on describing all this forever, but each person has to experience it for themselves. When that inner sense of divinity, of wholeness and completeness becomes mature, then, according to Adyashanti, you see and intuit that the same divinity is everything. So you know that everything and everyone is that divinity, no matter what the experience is, no matter what they're going through, and no matter what form it takes. A human being, a cloud, a rock, a force, a wave, ocean, a lake, a can of garbage in the city. There's a sense of that astounding divinity everywhere. But that, as it really matures, this astounded quality of divinity starts to lessen, since there's no reflection on what it's not. In other words, you forget the old state of egoic being, and now the divinity inside and outside becomes more like just a lived reality. it takes on a kind of normalcy. Everybody thinks that they will be waking around in ecstasy all the time, ecstasy for the divine, for God. According to Adyashanti, you may well experience moments of ecstasy, but as spiritually matures, you no longer mistake your ecstasy for God. Ecstasy is simply one form that experience took for a moment, for an hour maybe, or for a month, or however long. This is one of the more challenging and confusing parts of the realization of going beyond ego. That is, mistaking spiritual experiences for reality itself. There is still a subtle separation between you as a self and your experience of self. It's like when you meet another person. Hello, how are you? You say and you talk to them and you share your stories and viewpoints and you are getting to know the person. However, your experience of them is not who they are. Your experiencing of them is your experience of them. It's not the same as who they are. Your experience of someone is very different from their experiencing of who they are. This is what we are always mistaken, says Adyashanti. Our experience of something or someone for what someone or something actually is. We forget that what someone actually is completely different from our experience of them or it. When one starts to realize this, it can be very disconcerting, because for a long, long time we have made this fundamental error of thinking that our experience of things is what they are. And we can take this right into spirituality and think, my experience of divinity, my experience of God and the truth is what the truth of God or divinity is. However, self in its seed form is the act of self-consciousness. It's self-conscious looking within, i.e. on its experiences, and in a certain sense, just as before, identifying with which it is experiencing. No self is when self-consciousness stops. The word self does not denote an entity or a thing or a somebody looking with or being self-consciousness. The experience of no self, says Adyashanti, is when this looking within stops. Indeed, when self-consciousness stops, there's no reference within anymore. It doesn't mean that you don't see anything or hear anything or taste anything or feel anything. It doesn't mean that you fall into some kind of unconsciousness or that you can go blank. However, you are falling into a state of unself-consciousness. Again, one can say why it happens, nor can self-consciousness stop being self-conscious. For everything self-consciousness does not be self-conscious is an act of self-consciousness. It kind of wraps itself up. Self-consciousness is just a particular type of consciousness, says Adyashanti, and we cannot understand what it is until it's not there anymore, says Adyashanti. It's like ego. You cannot fully understand ego until it's not there anymore. Then you understand it. Self in the same way, we can't really completely understand it experientially until it's not there. And then you understand it because you know it is what's no longer there. Then the understanding of it is quite obvious, quite simple. When self falls away, there's no alternative identity. It is not exchanging a little identity for a bigger identity, or an egoic identity for a divine identity. No self means essentially no identity. It's hard to think of oneself. Here is where the language breaks down, says Adyashanti, in any other terms than a self, and also to think of oneself in any other terms than an identity. We start with an egoic identity, small, very well defined, even though it's very chaotic. And when that drops away, then our identity goes into a vast state and will say, I am awareness. Awareness is something which is very transparent. It's not like an ego. It's very transparent and very quiet. It's very unifying and it's very whole. When you have a very deep experience of awareness, well, then it sees itself as everything it's aware of. That's also another identity, though. So, spirituality, in one sense, is going from a less true identity that is more dense and confined and solid to a more transparent and vast. The more true identity is, the less confined, the less solid, the less defined, until identity finally just drops away entirely. And in that case, one can't say anything because all statements would be a kind of identity statements. They are claims, they are definitions, but in the real experience of no self, there is no claim. There is no I am this, I am not that. There is no identity. There is no description. Anyway, there is an obviousness of what it is, according to Adyashanti. For example, you may say that it is infinite knowing itself, recognizing itself. The knowing of what it is not as an act of self-consciousness. That's not conceivable to the way our minds are hooked up. Unfortunately, when we run into something that's not conceivable, says Adyashanti, our minds start to form a new ideology and a new philosophy about it instead of staying with the fact that what is beyond self is not conceivable to self or ego or mind, full stop. One of the great barriers to all this are all the projections that the mind has. There are endless ways of mind imagining what it is going to be like instead of just confessing that it can't possibly know until it does. As we have seen, all these states and transitions having been described occur on a kind of trajectory, a spectrum, from a dense, contracted identity of ego to a more subtle, more transparent identity, which is more unified, until it gets almost entirely unified, seeing itself as everywhere and everything. And then that last act of self-consciousness falls away, and there's just the infinite experiencing and knowing itself. According to Adyashanti, there are different kinds of awakenings on the trajectory or spectrum, and as we have seen, it is easy to mistake one for the other and to condense everything down into one thing.